All right, so it is Friday, July 14th. My name is Paul Ortiz, the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. I'm here with Mr. Andrew Bagley and the Helena World. First of all, Mr. Bagley, thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed.
No problem. Happy to help.
And today, one of the things we wanted to talk to you about was the world, you know, your role in it, like how you feel about the world and the role of print media in kind of informing people.
Well, I think the role of particularly the small community newspaper is essential because the only time a television station is going to come here is if we have some particularly gruesome murder or some really bad scandal. They don't come to cover school board meetings. They don't come to cover city council meetings. And we are the reliable source of information for our community. And so that is a vital role to play. If we weren't here, God knows what school boards would try to do. Right. And then beyond just the basic watchdog function that a free press plays in a society, we write the first draft of the history of this community, the obituaries, the sports games, with the pictures of kids, the honor rolls and the graduations. None of those things would get covered if you did not have the small community newspaper. And so I think that there's always going to be a role for those going forward.
Now, did you grow up with that understanding of the media, or is that something like, when did you first get excited about becoming part of this?
Well, my background is in political science, and at one time there was a political career. So you've always got to understand media and all when you're in that field, and the ability to shape public opinion was always something that I was interested in from an academic standpoint. And when I came back home, and of course, in my younger days, I was much hungrier. And so you took on a little extra work here and there. And one of the things I did was stringer work. Started out mostly sports, covering football games, and got interested. People liked my writing. Started to do a little more of it over the years. And before we bought this newspaper, I was covering school board meetings. For the Helena World, and they had roped me into doing that because at one time I had been on the school board and kind of knew where the skeletons were buried, so it was kind of a logical choice.
And can you talk a little bit about your educational background? Because you mentioned originally it was political science.
Right. I have a bachelor's degree in political science and history from Ouachita Baptist University in Arkadelphia, Arkansas. I have a master's degree in political science from Baylor. I have additional graduate work on a PhD that I never finished from Louisiana State.
Very good. Now, is newspaper or writing, is it in your family blood, or is it something?
No, it's just something that I fell into, kind of. My mother is an English teacher. My father was a principal. Both spent, Daddy spent all of his career just to the west of here at Barton High School. And the way I ended up in the newspaper business is Gatehouse Media owned the Helena World. And in late August 2019, they announced that the last edition of this paper would be September the 6th of that year. And I went to a friend of mine. I said, do you want to try to save this paper? Because we obviously need a local paper. And he had some experience in the business world, and he dealt with New York. I dealt with the local people, and we were able to purchase the editorial assets. We didn't get this building at that time, and they did their last edition on the 6th of September, and by the 18th we were back in publication.
Wow.
and it's been that way ever since. We've since bought a newspaper in Brinkley, Arkansas, and called the Monroe County Argus, and we plug along. We're not getting rich. I was telling you before we went on camera that I get a check when after everybody else gets theirs. But I think we do a very important function. I think we're serving this community well. There's some things that if we had not been here might have gone unnoticed, and people wouldn't have even known that they were going on, particularly in city government and in the public schools.
Mr. Bagg, what are some of your proudest moments in terms of your leadership of the paper and what you've been able to bring out?
My proudest moment was roughly a year ago. They had the 2022 Arkansas Press Association Editorial Awards Contest, awards luncheon. And this was based on the 2021 work. And of course, at that time, we had been in business 2 years. And we won the General Excellence Awards, which essentially meant we're the best small weekly newspaper in Arkansas for that year. So we put that on the front page with the headline "From Dead to Best," because this paper was dead, and then we're on top, and we're looking to see if we can repeat that this year. The luncheon for the awards is next week, as a matter of fact. So it would be huge if we could go back to back after being in such horrible shape when we took over.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Congratulations. So one of the things, I want to get back, I have a couple other questions about how you've been able to really guide the world. And it's a really impressive paper, just looking through it. But Dr. Olson wanted us to talk with you specifically about water and the water crisis. And as you mentioned before, water's huge here, but there's a difference maybe between what's happening in Elaine, what's happening in Helena. So could you kind of give us a overview?
Well, Helena's been in the news because we had a catastrophic failure that began on June the 25th. And I was affected by that West Helena outage. I live on the West Helena water system. I went without water for a week. We got our taste of what it's like to live in the third world. And it's this specific thing is a concatenation of failures. One thing gets fixed, another thing breaks, but it's years of the chickens coming home to roost, years of bad choices in terms of spending. You cannot spend all of your money on salaries and not take care of your maintenance. And that's what they've done in the school system here. And why the tax increase had to be so steep to replace the facilities, because you didn't take care of the ones you had. And eventually it reached a point where you had to have new. And that's where we are with our water systems. They have deferred and deferred and deferred, and quite frankly, we need replacements in a lot of these cases. You've got galvanized pipe in the ground in some places. The last estimate I heard is it could be 30-40% of the system still has not been replaced on the West Helena side. Helena's had a boil order this year. It's not exactly in good shape. But to give you an example of, and this is not to place all of the blame on the last city council, because they don't bear all of the blame. But they do blame some of it, contrary to what they want to tell you, which is that none of it's their fault. They inherited it all. Some of them been there 10, 15 years. Last year, we had you had the infusion of the COVID money. Actually, correct that, 2021. And so that could be spent for infrastructure. Now, would approximately $1 million have solved all these problems? No. Might they have fixed enough that we didn't have to live like we were out there with an outhouse since the toilets wouldn't flush? Possibly, probably. Could have fixed enough to do that. Certainly could have fixed the filters in the computer system that failed. But instead of fixing infrastructure, they chose to spend that all on bonuses, including the political people, the elected folks. And so I think that matters, even though they want to tell you that it doesn't matter, because that these problems had been brewing for a long time. And so they're correct. They have been brewing for a long time. They're incorrect that they bear none of the responsibility, because while they've been there, they've done nothing to try to fix it.
But that's a problem. And see, I know nothing about this until, just before we drove over here from Florida. But that's not just a Helena problem, right? That's a problem that goes further down the Delta with water.
We've got water problems in a lot of places because the communities have lost a lot of their tax base. We've lost a lot of people, and when you lose people, your sales taxes go down because they're not here to spend the money anymore. And that is a regional problem. The Delta has been steadily losing population. That's all factual. I guess my criticism is that governments are not always making the best choices with the limited resources they have. And of course, then we could have a debate about the state having over $1 billion surplus and its priorities for that. Because the state is prioritizing additional tax cuts and building more prisons. And is not putting as much emphasis on infrastructure spending as I think that they should. But those are all long, complicated debates. In the meantime, the best politics is local, and our local officials have failed us in many of these communities.
What is the, talking about population loss, and on the Mississippi side, we've talked to folks there in previous years. Do you think that's just inevitable, like that the Delta is going to continue to lose folks, or do you see ways that?
No, it's not inevitable, but we've got to do some things to get our house in order. Let's take Helena, for instance. We're losing population at a huge clip. But we have some assets to market. We've got a largely undeveloped Slackwater Harbor that nearly all the infrastructure you need is in place to attract one of those rather large plants and bring in jobs and people. One of the things holding us back beyond that is you got to have some measure of quality of life for folks when they come and evaluate your community. And we've got to get our public schools straightened out. And I spent a good bit of my political career trying to work on that. But right now, if you had an executive come in here to look, that's going to be something we've got to explain what our plan is. Because our public schools are not measuring up. And so we've got to clean this town up. And when you drive around, and I'll give the current mayor credit for this, because he and I don't always agree on a lot of stuff, and which is well documented in our paper as well. He is knocking the crap down. And trying to get the stuff out of here. You saw it when you were coming here to this facility, that they've done a lot even in the last 2 weeks. But that's something we've got to do. We've got to clean this place up. We've got to improve the appearance. We've got to get our schools straightened out. And we've got to now we know we've got an infrastructure issue, because what plant is going to want to put in a huge facility and not know that the water is going to be reliable?
That's a question, Paul.
Oh, yeah, please.
Thank you. Martin Weston here with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. I want to talk to you about the news I've been watching. It seems that the area is focused on what's happening in Memphis. And I'm wondering, even in your paper, I was looking for where's the connection with what's happening in Little Rock or the state capitol. And we talked about how investigative resources are limited. We're talking about ads and things. But do you occasionally make a focus on what's happening in the State House and what that connection to the local area is, and why is it so focused on the news in Memphis?
Well, part of the interest in Memphis is where we sit based on all those FCC rules and stuff with the cable companies, and which local channels the satellite and cable providers have to offer based on your distance from a certain place. We are in the Memphis local market, and I don't like it either. But they have to carry the Memphis locals, and so that's what they do. So that's why we always know what's going on in Memphis. When it comes to when we branch out beyond the local news and go to state news, it typically, our approach is when it is something directly affecting what happened here. And if you go back over the past 2 or 3 months, the issue that has been affected locally as it relates to state capital and its politics has been whether or not the Marvel E. Lane School District would even survive. Because when the legislative session began, the law was if you were in level 5, which is the worst rating a school district could get in Arkansas, and you had less than 350 students K-12, then you had to be shut down and administratively consolidated or annexed. And that's where Marvel was when the legislative session started. And so there was a lot of legislative activity around trying to save Marvel, with State Representative McElroy's House Bill 1504, and then provisions of the governor's signature education reform and what she called the LEARNS Act, with some things that would allow that district to stay open. And of course, now we've had a lawsuit over that LEARNS law, and it's on again, off again, but we've covered that in pretty good detail. We do have one columnist on the opinion page that focuses on statewide issues. So our people do get some exposure to that. Occasionally we'll throw something up on the website from a wire service about that as well. But we try to, our niche is the local news. That's what we give that no one else does. And that's our bread and butter, and that's going to always be the bulk of what's in copy.
What is the role of local coverage in terms of influencing issues, though, that come out of the state capitol? I'm thinking a local C-SPAN type thing, or, I mean, how can the local area survive if pressure isn't put, or attention at least put on those, further up the line? Well,
and occasionally we have influenced. I think our coverage of the local, the West Helena School District certainly played a role in getting the state's attention and to take it back over and move it into level 5. Mm-hmm. We did, in fact, we're still getting criticized by at least one city councilman for this. In 2021, in a city that has more than its fair share of crime, we had a city councilman, and we've got the clips, and no matter how much he wants to rewrite history, that moved to defund positions in the police department. Now, he can say whatever was on his mind. He didn't express much besides get rid of positions in the police department. And the word defund was used. And, of course, that newspaper ended up in Little Rock being handed around the Capitol, and they passed a law to require cities to fund a police department. And so, we unintentionally influence state policy with that story. So I think state officials pay attention to what their local papers are saying, and ours, I think, has farther reach than just the Helena delegation.
Mm-hmm. I just have one more before I hand it back to you, Paul. And I want to thank you for being so candid in your responses.
Hey, I've been doing this long enough. Yeah. I'm not worried about it anymore. They can take it or leave it.
Yeah, and for folks visiting as well, mm-hmm. For us, we only get the clips. So in terms of being, kind of a tour guide for us, how would you describe this situation with, either the local crime issue with the funding of the police, or how would you describe this issue with the schools in a way that somebody who's just visiting for a short period of time can get a larger picture of it?
If you have to get it down to a bumper sticker mm-hmm. over what our greatest problem is here, because people talk a lot about money, they talk a lot about programs, and this, that, and other. It's leadership. It's having strong, competent leadership that is willing to make the tough calls and not worry about the next election, and making sure that these local governmental units are doing what they're supposed to do. Because that element comes into play with every one of these problems. To the extent that you get any leadership at all out of a lot of these people, it's CMA kind of leadership. And that's not what we need. We need people that are willing to level with folks and then be willing to follow through. But we spend too much time, some would say corrupt maneuvering, some would say self-serving, but we're not trying to do the greatest good for the greatest number with the limited resources we have. and they spend too much time trying to blame somebody else. And when the buck gets close to their desk, something is coming, some excuse. And some of them are worse than others.
We may have a question about historical preservation. Avery's very interested in that topic. But I wonder if, I'm looking at these cartoons on your wall. Could you tell us a little bit about those?
George Fisher was a longtime editorial cartoonist for the Arkansas Gazette, which is, of course, now a part of the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette. And I had an opportunity at an estate sale to buy these prints that a former state legislator and Speaker of the House from Helena named Ernest Cunningham had. And he was leaving town. And you've got Frank White, who, of course, upset Bill Clinton in 1980.
Oh, wow. For governor.
Yes. And, of course, lost to Clinton in 82. But Frank White was very skilled in that he took advantage of Clinton's youthful exuberance could be interpreted as arrogance. And, of course, this is the history teacher, because I was 5 when all this happened.
Wow.
And then Clinton raised the fees for car tags, and he accepted Cuban refugees in Fort Smith. So it was car tags and Cubans that put Frank White in office. Then you've got, of course, Winthrop Rockefeller, who was, the only other Republican governor since Reconstruction, other than Frank White, during that second half of the 20th century. Senator Pryor, Senator Bumpers, and then, of course, Clinton on his bicycle.
I didn't recognize Clinton.
But yeah, we're quite proud of those. And it's a nice little backdrop for a newspaper conference room.
Wow. Political cartooning, I think that's one of the sad things. Some people say, I'm not an expert on it, but some people call it the lost art.
Well, some of it is expenses. Some of it is, in this politically correct, super sensitive, safe space day and age we live in, cartoonists have to be real careful, which means they're not as good at their job, because that kind of humor is inevitably about pushing the envelope. They had a controversy in Memphis, and a guy lost his job where he did a caricature of a public official who just happens to be a very healthy female. And he drew her in a caricature as fat. They fired him. He went on television, and he said, "I drew her like she is. She's obese." And that's the problem I think we have with a lot of stuff, is just an inability to laugh at oneself because we're super sensitive. You can't crack a joke about anybody. You can't be frank about anything without somebody trying to come and cancel. And I get threatened with that every day. We'll cancel our subscription and all that stuff. And I've lost some subscriptions for some things that we've done. In fact, one of them I'm going to win an award for. We've got a huge animal control problem around here. And it was last year, and we had packs of dogs that were streetwise. They looked both ways for to cross the street. They felt like this was their neighborhood, not ours. And they came walking by one day, and I was going to go take a picture of the pack. Well, being fat and slow, by the time I got out the door, most of them had gone, but a pair had stopped in the alley for some romantic pursuits, while a third one watched. I got the picture of that. I called my partner. I said, "Now, I've got this, but we're going to take some heat if we put this on the front page." He said, "Run it." So we put that on the front page with the headline, "Out of Control," to illustrate how bad the animal control problem had gotten. It was very effective. It caused a lot of discussion. But I had people call and cancel their subscriptions over that. And sometimes you just got to be willing to do that. And I think too many times media executives, particularly in the big conglomerates, aren't willing to take some heat and back their people up to allow them to push the envelope and do things that need to be done to get people's attention.
Kind of follow up on that. What you mentioned that it's important to be sometimes critical or cynical or bring the point. I notice comedians these days are having the same problem as editorial newspaper. What is the responsibility that a newspaper has or an editor or publisher have to follow up more frequently with those types of examples, to put it in the face of people that here is another way to look, at a situation, or to maybe not take yourself so seriously, to let criticism become a focus of analysis of local issues. What's your responsibility? How often should you be doing that?
And I think if we're going to have an opinion page, it needs to have a real opinion every week. I think it is incumbent upon us to occasionally offer commentary that throws caution to the wind in some cases and says, look, this is the reality. Folks may not want to hear it, but this is what we're dealing with. I caught 9 cans of hell over running, pictures of folks that were killed because they had a joint. One of them had a joint in his mouth. Some of that was the availability of photographs that we had. But it said it was a negative portrayal of an otherwise nice young man. But the reality was he wasn't quite so nice. And it's a tragedy that he's gone. He was in my son's class. My son was a friend of his, but we had a responsibility, I think, to paint an accurate picture of what had happened, who had died, and what the circumstances were around those murders. So I think we've got to be the ones that say we're not running for office. And people need to support that mission, even if they're mad at this edition or that one. They need to realize if we're not here, it's worse for everybody. Because if you don't pay for the news, you're eventually going to pay for not having it.
This is Avery Goodman with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. You mentioned that this building is on the National Register, correct? Mm-hmm. What was the process like? And I know every building here in Elaine has the best bones possible for National Registry. How was your process for this building like?
It was paperwork hell. Mm-hmm. They don't make it easy to put all that together. Fortunately, there were previous historical society articles and things like that had already been done where I didn't have to reinvent the wheel. The Press Association had a lot of history on the paper itself that I could access. But it is an arduous process to get a building on the register. And then it's even harder, when you're trying to get the tax credits on the renovation for that. The federal is just, it took me months to get those tax credits approved. The state was probably about 8 to 12 weeks.
And then do you have any local companies that do construction at all, or do you have to outsource everything?
We were able to hire local people for most of what we did with this building. We have contractors that can do smaller kinds of jobs. We've only got one that can take on a relatively big one. But if you were going to, like for when we built the new high school, roughly $27 million project, we had to have an outside construction manager. And their subcontractors, a lot of them weren't local because the job was just so big, our people couldn't do it.
And then kind of going on to schooling, I mean, we were in Elaine yesterday and the rundown shut down school. Where did kids go to school now, and what was schooling like during COVID when they were all online?
Well, you have your 3 traditional public school districts in this county. You have 2 private schools, and then you have a charter. But you'll notice that there's nothing in terms of campuses in the southern half of the county because there used to be a school district at Lakeview and another one at Elaine, which have closed. So kids are being bused. a lot already. That was part of the reason Marvel needed to stay open, is the busing was only going to get worse. So during COVID, it was like everybody else. You know, for a little while the buildings were shut, and everybody was online, which in a community like ours is problematic for multiple reasons. One is not everybody has access to high-speed internet. I have an issue here that we can't do much in terms of, for instance, we tried to do live debates on some of the races during the last election cycle, and it kept buffering. And so we ended up having to do tape delay. And that's here in the biggest city in the county. Even for those that can access high speed, or what we're being sold as high speed, there's a cost issue, because we're not treating broadband like a utility that people ought to have access to and be able to afford. We don't regulate it. So those two things alone probably exacerbated our learning loss in terms of comparison to other districts around the state.
This is Donovan Carter with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. Continuing more onto schooling, I want to ask about perhaps how the changes in the school systems that you've mentioned about, Marvel having to remain open, and touching also on earlier things we said about kind of news from outside of this county coming in, like the Memphis region news. Have you seen an influx of perhaps outside influence coming into the school board meetings, into things like that?
No, we create our own controversies. We don't have to have any outside help. Moms for Liberty is not here, or any of the other activist groups on the right or the left. No, we pretty well can create our own fights and have our own loser leave town matches and stuff like that. That's not to say that our schools aren't controversial, because we'll just pull these out. And let me make sure I get these in order for the camera. The superintendent is fired. The superintendent is back. Then the superintendent quits. And then the state takes over. Now, this was all in a span of about 8 weeks. Now, that's what I meant about leadership problems. It's that kind of instability and controversy in our institutions all the time. And we don't have to have any outside help to manufacture that. In fact, what we end up doing is begging for some outside help, begging the state to take over, even though that's not a perfect solution. Because what you end up with the state taking over are suitcase superintendents who are not invested in the community, high-level administrators that the only business that they support are the convenience stores as they buy gas and a snack on their way out of town at the end of the day. So the state is not always the answer, but at least it stabilizes the situation. People are clamoring for federal or state intervention in our water system in this community. And the local folks don't want to talk about that. The state certainly doesn't want to be here. Their attitude about Helena is typically let this cup pass from me, to get biblical with the Baptist degrees. But this situation is bad enough. It warrants the kind of federal attention that finally came to Jackson, Mississippi, where local leadership failed those people. And it continues to fail those people, and they continue to fight about how to fix it. But in the meantime, the water needs to run out of the tap, and the sewer needs to flow out of the toilet. And the only way to get that was the feds had to come in, because that system is so big.
And going on the water, do y'all have a public or private utility company?
We have public water and sewer. Entergy is the electrical provider for most of the area. Woodruff Electric Cooperative Service is another portion, and then Summit Utilities does the natural gas. Optimum is the cable and internet provider, And then, of course, you got AT&T.
And have y'all experienced grid shutdowns in the recent couple of years? I know someone, Elaine mentioned it. Has West Helena?
No, that's the one thing we haven't had to worry about was the grid problem. Now, what happens here is the infrastructure. Entergy has let a lot of it get really old. So anytime there's a storm, there's an old wooden pole breaking, power outages, things like that. But, that's an infrastructure problem.
It's obvious that someone has to be the voice of the community or to inspire voices. And I know as a publisher and editor of this particular institution, you must have connections with the religious community, the builders, the blue jean and black tie, guys, the power utility company people. What do you see as your responsibility in bringing controversies of worth to make change, if necessary, not only here, but over in Elaine? Because you've showed us these newspapers, and the schools are closed over there. I interviewed a man yesterday that said that community is going to die when you don't bring kids in. There's nothing left. So you obviously are aware of these issues. You bring a public discussion to bear for people. But what do you see any responsibility overall to specifically speak to those communities that I just mentioned to try to, make them look for more positive solutions? You've talked about leadership. So what is the specific role that your newspaper plays in pushing those?
Our role is to shine the light, provide information, and on our opinion page, provide some potential thoughts about solutions to problems or about how we got here and why they were caused. I suffer, like any other small media organization, from a lack of manpower. And so Helena does get more attention. And Marvel gets more attention because I have boots on the ground. I have somebody but she's very busy, so Elaine's not getting as much attention, which is that's much to the consternation of the mayor down there. But I keep telling her there's only so much of me to go around, and that. And of course, we know that there are lots of controversies between the Elaine Legacy Center and the Lee Street Community Center, which happens to be the organization that the mayor is associated with. And so I just told her one day, I said, if you want to submit stuff like Dr. Olson does, I'll run it. I'm still waiting. But we do have a responsibility because Elaine that was my first teaching job, was at Elaine Elementary School. It is a sad thing that has happened down there. But to turn it around, you've got to fix your infrastructure. You've got to develop some kind of niche to make people want to be down there. But to get people to live there, you're going to have to have high-speed internet. You're going to have to clean the place up. You've got to eliminate the food desert and find a niche to bring people down there every once in a while. When they had the school, there was traffic because there were ball games and other school activities where people came to Elaine for some of those. And they've not been able to figure out how to fill that void. And it's sad because it's just dried up. It hasn't been that long ago that they had a grocery store, they had a furniture store, they had a hardware store. The school had 800 kids, but now there's just nothing.
Couldn't you forecast, in your opinion, the next 25 years in Elaine from the perspective of a person who shines that light and who makes connections in the various communities, whether it's the religious speaking community or the builder speaking community or the local community here? What do you believe is the inclination of the citizens here as far as that situation? Is it to watch and observe? Is it to get involved and make a difference? Or is it to say, bless their hearts?
There's a certain amount of bless their hearts because, Helena's struggling too. I think that the folks around Helena, the Marvels, the Elaines, the Barton, and the Lexes, have got to recognize that their survival is inextricably intertwined with Helena's. because there is this attitude, I don't want to be in Helena, I don't want nothing to do with Helena, because Helena has all that crap going on. And so if they're going to survive, Helena must be successful. Helena's got to have the economic development because it's got the harbor. It's got, even though the infrastructure is in kind of bad shape, it has the necessary infrastructure to support a large number of residents. And a lot of the people, because the schools are bad right now, will choose to live out there and go to other school systems if we ever land a big plant. But they need Helena's crime to go down. They need Helena to get their act together and cleaned up. And we need to get the big hit on the economic development front. And then you begin to see the rising tide does lift all boats. Elaine has some things going for it. Because just as south of there is some of the best hunting and the best fishing in America. And recreational activities as the Delta Heritage Trail runs right through there. Now the state could help them out if they would build a road connecting Snow Lake to either Arkansas City or Watson in Desha County and open up a travel artery through there that would bring people right through Elaine. But you're going to have to get past your high-dollar hunting clubs and your tree-hugging environmentalists to get that done. But that would be huge for them if they could just get a road to open things up.
Mr. Bagley, we've taken up a lot of your time. I know you're very busy with the world, but there are just a couple kind of concluding questions. In thinking about what you've said about economic development, I know this is a big issue in a lot of parts of Florida, too. And recently, the state and a lot of local communities have turned to, again, kind of historical preservation and also culture. I'm kind of looking at the King Biscuit Blues Festival and some of the posters you have up there. What role has culture played, or, even tourism, like connected to history or culture, like in this area? What role could it play?
Oh, it's huge. And the King Biscuit Blues Festival is like our Mardi Gras. I mean, we're a town of about 10,000 people, and it'll balloon to 50 or 60 over that weekend. And so I think that kind of tourism is huge. I know Elaine is trying to build some around the massacre and that story. And of course, there's some difficulties in trying to do that we could talk all day about. But tourism has got to be a part of it. Helena was the site of a Civil War battle on the same day as Vicksburg and Gettysburg. And so we've tried to capitalize on the Civil War tourism. And of course, that's not as big as it used to be, as it becomes somewhat taboo on many levels. Particularly, like Richmond had a big tourism business with their Monument Row that they decided to just sacrifice to take them down. We've got these interpretive parks and all these other things, and people don't come as much. The Civil War reenactments aren't bringing as many people. But that's something we tried to capitalize on from a tourism standpoint. We're right on the river. The catfish tournaments are starting to take off, drawing more and more people, but they're only here for a day. So there's a limit to what tourism can do, but it is an important component.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've talked about, some of the challenges that the county and that the Upper Delta faces. But what are some of the things, like if you were telling people why they should come here, like, because, even in Elaine, now our program has been going to Elaine since 2019. And one of the things that my students have said, the different generations of students have said is, there's a lot of challenges, but wow, people in the Delta are so resilient. And that's what I found when I was a grad student at Duke and I first came. And I actually did interview work in Brinkley, by the way. And we were based at the Fargo Agricultural School. And I think there's a farmers co-op there too at that time. But can you talk about like the resilient side maybe, and like what makes this region so like incredible?
If you live here, resiliency is required, first of all, because it's not easy like it used to be to be here. You've got to want to be here. But you'll find that most of the people here, not all, because we've got some rotten apples, and they're loud. But most of the people here are some of the nicest people you will ever meet. They're obviously hardworking if they can make it here. If you like to be in the outdoors, there's no better place in America to be, with all of the outdoor recreational opportunities that we have in this region. If you like history, you can just soak it up around here. It's in the air, and I would say in the water, but right now we don't want to talk about the water. We're strategically positioned to have economic growth with the location that we have on the river near. It would help if we had a 4-lane bridge, but we're just 10 miles from interstate quality highway. We've got rail. And then once you get a job here, you can live really well here on the money that you make. Housing costs are cheap, nice houses. Then the cost of living for most things is not as high as it would be in Little Rock or Memphis. You can just do so much more with less, and you are only an hour from Memphis to go watch an NBA game, go to some 5-star white tablecloth restaurant if that's what you want to do, or if you want to walk Bill and go clubbing, since we've only got one club left. But there's just so many assets, and we are much better than our public image. And that public image has been shaped by our own stupid mistakes and failures. And, you know, the political world has failed us. But if we could just get our local governments to do right, I think you would see a much different attitude about health, because we've got a lot to give, a lot to offer. And I believe you'd have a lot of people who left here for job opportunities come home if those job opportunities ever returned here.
You'll forgive me, Mr. Bagley, but I just have got to take advantage of this opportunity looking at the cartoons. Bill Clinton's legacy in Arkansas.
It's a mixed bag. He did some great things in terms of raising educational standards, increasing investment in schools, modernizing the state in many ways. But there were also a lot of missed opportunities to do more. And there was one-party control of a different variety back then. But he always had one eye on something bigger. And I think everybody knew that. But he's one of the most brilliant politicians of our time. You know, he's up there with FDR, Reagan, and him. Probably is the 3 most skilled politicians combined with being successful in governing that we saw in the second half of the 20th century. Well, FDR just before that, but World War II forward. So his legacy is one of greatness, but also one of, missteps and missed opportunities. Because, there was, like I said, there was a chance to do a whole lot more.
What was his springboard? You think of Ron DeSantis now is, he's launched his official run, and a lot of folks are saying you just don't get to the White House from Florida. But I remember, I'm old enough to remember people that said the same thing back in the day. They said, how do you get from Arkansas to the White House? How did Clinton do that?
Well, of course, the political environment was much different 30 years ago. when he ran for office. You could not do today what Bill Clinton did in 1992. Was Bill Clinton, throughout the late 80s and leading up to that race, positioned himself, if you'll, and of course I'm fixing to show how much older I am than they are, as a new Democrat. They've never grown up with politics that gravitated to the center. They've grown up with a polarized version because, quite frankly, James Carville is right, and my politics tend to be in the middle. I ran as a Democrat when I was running, but James Carville's right. The Democrats have become so woke, they're going to get put to sleep. And they have in places like Arkansas, where just 20 years ago they ran the place. And now the party can't even field candidates for some of these offices. And then the Republicans have gone so far out there to the right on some of these issues that they're not able to capitalize on the Democrats' mistakes at the national level. Now, clearly, in Arkansas, we're probably the reddest state in the union, with 82 Republicans in a 100-member House, 29 Republicans in a 35-member Senate. And the Republicans have all 7 of the state constitutional offices and all 6 of the federal officials. But in 2007, it was almost the exact opposite. I think it was, when the Democrats had all 7 of the statewide constitutional offices. But Bill Clinton, getting back to your question, was able to create this notion of a new Democrat in the center with the Democratic Leadership Council. A guy that didn't demean or make fun of conservative Christian cultural values, but at the same time spoke to good, hardworking, church-going people's economic problems. And if you look at Poland, when you peel back the layers of the onion, beyond just simple approval, disapproval of this party or that official, you find that even today, it's not as pronounced as it would have been 30 years ago, but even today, most Americans are somewhere in that middle. But because of the polarization and the primary system, because we've basically taken the party power brokers out of the business of picking nominees. And that's how you end up with people from AOC to Matt Gaetz. Because that's what we're getting out of these primaries. We're getting the extremists. Whereas used to, the two-party system pushed us into the middle. And so Bill Clinton comes along, Democratic Leadership Council, and you've got a Democrat who says we're going to raise taxes, we're going to invest in these programs that are not radical left-wing programs. He's talking about schools. He's talking about infrastructure. He's talking about cops on the streets to help you with your crime. You wouldn't see a Democrat today come back to his home state to sign a death warrant and have an execution in the middle of a presidential campaign. Bill Clinton did that. As a consequence, he was able to, if you take away the impeachment, get a lot of things done. And can you imagine today, Biden and Kevin McCarthy will never get done what Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich got done. Because all the fighting, the short government shutdowns, Clinton and Gingrich got things done eventually. That's not going to happen with this bunch in this environment anymore. It's just not. And that's why he will go down as one of the great ones. I mean, he eliminated the deficit. We were paying down debt under Bill Clinton. But that was a product of him and the Republicans doing some things together and everybody giving a little bit.
Workfare.
Yeah, workfare was, now there's no even talk about those kinds of things on the Democratic side. And the Republicans, with the work requirements in Arkansas that they've tried to put on the expansion of Medicaid, it's going to be dead on arrival in the Biden administration. And what the answers are, I don't think any of us have all of them, but the current environment is not going to give them to us, because unless you have total one-party control of government, nothing's going to happen.
Well, any other questions before we kind of
I'll give y'all all the time you want.
well, this says you're busy and doing really good, amazing work. But as we kind of wrap up, are there any final thoughts or things you'd like to talk about that we haven't touched upon?
I just would like for anybody that ends up watching this to understand that the Delta has immense potential, and the assets are here to work with. But when they come, you know, they need to be committed. This is not, you can make a lot of money here, but you've got to be here. You got to get in the fight. You got to become a part of it. And if you ever do, it grows on you. It does. The people that have been forced to leave here are always saying, I miss it. They may lament some of the things that have happened and all that, but they always get back to, I miss it. I wish I could go back there and live that life again. And there's no other place in America like the Delta. But we do need some help.
Mr. Bagley, thank you so much.
No problem. I enjoyed talking to you.
Yes, thank you.
That was nice.